The early life and rise of Robert Mugabe. In the early morning light of a small rural village in Zimbabwe, a young boy watches as his mother tills the soil with unwavering determination. The sun casts long shadows across the fields as the hum of life in the village fills the air. Little did anyone know, the boy who stood silently by would one day rise to lead an entire nation out of the clutches of colonialism, a man whose name would stir controversy, admiration, and fear for decades. That boy was Robert Mugabe. Born in 1924, Robert Gabriel Mugabe came into a world deeply marked by the sting of British colonial rule. The colony, then known as Southern Rhodesia, was a land of sharp contrasts. While white settlers controlled vast swaths of fertile land, the black majority lived in poverty, excluded from the political and economic systems that governed their lives. For many, the idea of breaking free from such an entrenched system seemed like an impossible dream. But for Mugabe, it was a calling that would shape his destiny. Mugabe's early life was marked by hardship, yet it was these very struggles that would plant the seeds of his future resolve. Raised by his mother after his father left the family when Robert was just a child, Mugabe's life was not easy. His mother worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, a symbol of resilience in a world that gave them little. But the poverty and injustice he saw around him fueled a growing fire. Education became his escape, and he was determined to use it as a tool for change. At the age of 10, Mugabe was sent to a missionary school. It was there that he encountered the stark divide between the white settlers and the black population. While the white students received the best education, Mugabe was forced to make do with less. It was in this environment of inequality that he first began to form his ideas about justice, freedom, and the need for change. But education wasn't just a means of escaping poverty for Mugabe. It was his weapon against oppression. After completing his primary education, Mugabe continued his schooling at a Catholic boarding school, where he excelled in his studies. His intelligence caught the attention of his teachers, and they encouraged him to pursue further education. In the 1940s, Mugabe went to South Africa to attend the University of Fort Hare, a prestigious institution that had produced some of Africa's most influential leaders, including Nelson Mandela. It was here that Mugabe began to engage with more radical political ideas that would shape his future vision for Zimbabwe. But Mugabe's road to leadership wasn't straightforward. After leaving South Africa, he spent several years teaching in various countries, including Ghana, which was one of the first African nations to gain independence from colonial rule. It was during this time that he became deeply inspired by the rise of African nationalism. The winds of change were sweeping across the continent, and Mugabe, ever the student of history, saw the writing on the wall. Colonialism's days were numbered, and the fight for African freedom was gaining momentum. By the time he returned to Rhodesia in the early 1960s, Mugabe had become a committed revolutionary, determined to help his people break free from colonial rule. The situation in Zimbabwe was dire. The white minority government, led by Ian Smith, had refused to grant equal rights to the black population, even after decades of pressure from the international community. In 1964, Mugabe joined the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, a political party that aimed to overthrow the racist regime and bring about a free democratic Zimbabwe. Mugabe's voice quickly rose above the others, his intelligence and charisma propelling him to leadership. But Mugabe's journey was not without peril. In 1964, he was arrested for his role in the liberation movement and imprisoned for over a decade. It was during these years of incarceration that Mugabe's transformation from a political leader into a symbol of hope and resistance took place. He became the face of Zimbabwe's struggle for freedom, and his name became synonymous with defiance against the colonial regime. While imprisoned, he continued to study, reading Marxist and nationalist texts that further shaped his vision for Zimbabwe's future. After his release in 1974, Mugabe returned to the liberation struggle with renewed vigor. The country was now embroiled in a full-scale war of independence, as the black majority fought against the white minority government and their armed forces. Mugabe, having gained experience in guerrilla warfare, led ZANU's military wing, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, in battles against the regime. The fight for independence was brutal. Thousands of lives were lost, and the country was divided along ethnic and racial lines. But through it all, Mugabe remained resolute, a leader whose vision for Zimbabwe's future was unwavering. In 1979, the winds of change began to blow in the direction of peace. International pressure, combined with the growing resistance within Zimbabwe, led to the Lancaster House Agreement, which paved the way for a ceasefire and the first multiracial elections in the country's history. The agreement was a victory for the liberation movement, and Mugabe emerged as one of the key figures at the negotiating table. As a result, Mugabe was able to secure a political victory that would pave the way for his rise to the highest office in the land. In 1980, Zimbabwe officially became an independent nation, and Mugabe was elected as the country's first black prime minister. His leadership was celebrated by millions of Zimbabweans who saw him as a hero, the man who had led them out of the dark years of colonial oppression. His speeches were filled with promises of unity, prosperity, and justice. The country, led by Mugabe, would now chart its own course in the world, free from the shackles of colonialism. In the early years of his leadership, Mugabe worked to heal the divisions within the country. He advocated for reconciliation between the black and white populations, believing that Zimbabwe's future could only be secured if all citizens, regardless of race, came together to build a new society. Mugabe's early policies emphasized land reform, education, and healthcare, and the country made strides in addressing the inequalities left behind by colonial rule. However, despite these early successes, Mugabe's leadership was already beginning to show signs of a darker side. While he had won the hearts of many Zimbabweans, his rise to power also came at the cost of political opposition. By the mid-1980s, Mugabe's government began to crack down on dissent, silencing critics and consolidating power. But for now, Mugabe was a hero, a man who had delivered independence, who had toppled the colonial regime, and who had offered his people a brighter future. The story of Robert Mugabe is one of contradictions. He was both a man who fought for liberation and a leader who, over time, would become an autocrat. But in his early years, he was undeniably a force for change. From his humble beginnings in the fields of Zimbabwe to his rise as the leader of a free nation, Mugabe's journey was marked by a singular determination to bring an end to colonial oppression. For many Zimbabweans, he was the hero who led them out of darkness and into the light of independence. The road ahead would be far more complicated, but for a time, Mugabe was the embodiment of Africa's struggle for freedom, a symbol of the power of education, resilience, and the unyielding desire for justice.